next speaker is Walter Donway, who's going to speak about the grace to accept what we cannot change, the implications of inherent differences in temperament. Walter served as a trustee for the Atlas Society, I think from its founding up until...
First trustee?
Yeah, he was a founding trustee up until 2011, and has edited our first publication, the iOS Journal. He's published in, I think, all of our subsequent publications, The New Individualist. He has a piece in the book, The Republican Party Civil War, which we were discussing a little bit earlier. And he is our poet laureate, and you can take a look at his book, Touched by Its Rays, which we published, and I'm sure if they have any down on the table there, but you can go. They do have some there. You can go online and get it if you want it there as well, and has a number of other books. But I'll tell you, the reason why we have Walter here today, you can ask him to read his poetry later if you'd like. I'm sure he will oblige. He's going to talk about temperament, and he's going to be talking about things psychological. And part of the reason for that is that Walter was, I believe, the founding editor of Cerebrum, which is a journal that I think the Dana Foundation published, a quarterly journal about brain science. And this has been a very, very fascinating and important area of research over the last 2 decades. Understanding, we talk about human nature and the human mind and so forth, and there's actually been very good research, revolutionary research, I think, in the last couple of decades on how the mind works, how the brain works, etc. Walter gave a really fine talk, I think it was at Chapman some years ago, and I kept urging him, well, Walter, you need to follow up on this, and you need to follow up on this. And so anyway, it's been a few years, but Walter is finally following up on this, and is going to talk about some of the latest research. So without further ado, take it away, Walter.
Okay. Thank you very much. Be sure to tell me if you can't hear me, because I've been having trouble all morning. My son says it's because I'm old, but that's ridiculous. The most fun today might be to talk about different fictional characters and their temperament. How about movie characters created by Woody Allen versus, say, Paul Newman and Cool Hand Luke? And or can Ayn Rand's heroes be differentiated based on their temperament? Or, since they all have the same philosophy and the same reason and the same morality, are they all more or less in the same camp temperamentally? I'd like to talk about that in a question. We might have time for that then, but I first have to explain the research on temperament. In 1998, the Dana Foundation, I was there, created a quarterly journal called Cerebrum to engage both neuroscientists and lay readers, but only lay readers willing to engage our material on a very challenging level. Our editorial practice was to define every term once. We would tell you what a synapse was once. We'd tell you what the prefrontal cortex was once. So it's challenging. Most of the articles were written by active researchers in neuroscience, neurology, psychiatry, and other fields. Some of them Nobelists, and some who became Nobelists. And this comes up in temperament. You saw I immediately began to breathe much faster. It comes up. So from 1998 to 2006, my associate editor and I pounded and tenderized 5 beefy articles and 3 reviews every quarter, and came forth with a beautiful full-color journal, about 2,500 subscribers in the end. After I left Dana, Cerebrum continued on a monthly basis, just one online article. All the issues of Cerebrum, including a very fine review by David Kelly of a leading philosopher's book on volition, are yours to read for free at www.dana.org. I began with no familiarity with neuroscience except what I picked up from making neuroscience grants at Dana and what I learned on the job. But I did bring to the task an enduring fascination with psychology, and that had been strengthened by objectivism. I went to in New York to lectures of Nathaniel Brandon on the objectivist theory of psychology, read the books recommended by the NBI Book Service, and to group therapy sessions with Alan Blumenthal, who was then the ranking objectivist psychotherapist. My ideas didn't differ much from that old-time religion. Nathaniel Branden made more sense to me than any other psychologist I'd read. At the same time, I was the product of schooling in the 40s and 50s and college and grad school in the 60s and 70s, and later reading on my own, but also my psychotherapy, which included objectivist, psychoanalytical, and transactional. Actually, I had a boss who really resented these so-called medical appointments and sympathetically characterized them as crawling around on the floor wondering where it all went wrong. Thanks, boss. Beginning before I was born, particularly between the world wars and right up to, say, 1980, the fields of psychology and psychiatry were absolutely dominated by theories of nurture, by the fact that nurture, experience, shapes your personality. Freudian psychology swept the field with rare consensus, ascribing adult personality to the influences of family, personality of parents, conflicts with parents, early patterns of upbringing, and all of this came to be characterized by the phrase toilet training. So this was, when I started talking about Freudian psychology, this was it. Bring your daughter to work day, come on, Daddy, say something. Because, of course, they were non-judgmental and sat and more. Here we go. So, toilet training.
I wonder if this has something to do with inherent temperament.
All during this period, all the social sciences, psychology, sociology, anthropology, behaviorism, and their applications to education focused on how our experiences in life make us who we are. Perhaps behaviorism was the ultimate capitulation to nurture because it viewed stimulus and response as shaping all our behavior and chastely excluding any unscientific reference to consciousness. Anyway, onto this stage came Nathaniel Branden's objectivist psychology, arguing that what shapes us are not the passive pressures of experience, but how we respond to them, how we process them. And we do this by means of freely initiated exercise of reason. Around us from birth are pressures, enticements, lessons, punishments of our upbringing, striving to shape us, but they do so only if we're passive and when our inaction permits them to shape us. Either way, if we default or let our environment shape us, or if we actively shape ourselves, we are beings of self-made soul. By implication, soul maker of the self. Notice that objective psychology embraces nurture as the force tending to shape our personality, but it insists that unless our experiences literally cripple our minds, we can be masters of our soul. Consciously, or perhaps because of the dominating dogma of nurture, objectivism traveled with a nurture camp. Its crucial addition was to say that we are able, by choice, to nurture ourselves. The child in this drama is the father of the man. You make your own soul. But it was with a nurture camp. So, in fact, years ago, talk about nurture, years ago in New York City in the 70s, I heard a surprising assertion of this. Alan Blumenthal, one of Ayn Rand's inmost circle, insisted that Ayn Rand rejected the idea of differences in innate intelligence or IQ. That, according to her, if you had a normal mind, then she had no better cerebral apparatus between her ears than any normal person. If she had accomplished more intellectually, it was because she was more consistently initiated thought and was more intellectually honest. You could have done that all, pal. It was your choice. Even as he related this, I recall Dr. Blumenthal was shaking his head and saying, I think she's got better machinery. But you can see the nurture side of it. I mean, no, I'm not smarter. That's not what shaped me. I chose to be honest. I chose to think. That's why I was able to do all this. That's awfully hard for me to. I don't dispute the role of human freedom, our innate freedom to initiate directed reasoning, whatever the constraining circumstances. I don't dispute that freely initiated thought, and particularly persistence in it through life, can shape our personality in almost any environment. And that's what she was suggesting. All right, we take a breath here and prepare for a big transition. Focus now. The single greatest revelation to me during the years I edited Cerebrum was that free will's power to shape our personality is far more limited than I had assumed. Free will can steer us in many directions through our environment, in other words, our nurture. But nurture is not all that shapes us. To a far greater extent than I'd imagined, our personalities, what we become, how we face the world, our emotional makeup, and certainly our intelligence, are dominated by our nature, determined by innate differences in our brains. These differences arise from actions of our genes and to some extent from developmental factors, prenatal factors before birth. Our free will does not give us control, at least not yet, over these forces of nature. As an aside, I've heard among scientists discussing the role of genes in personality the comment that, well, every parent always knew that. So perhaps it was not irrelevant that during the years I was editing Cerebrum, I was also raising my son Ethan. Of all the new science that bombarded me at Cerebrum, nothing opened my mind to the claims of the nature camp more than research on inherited temperament. Of all the personality traits, one would have thought that temperament, supposed to be artsy affectation of a prima donna, pose of moody poets, quivering sensitivity of the painter, of all of them, you'd think that would have arose from a cultivation of attitudes, poses by parents, teachers, and the individual. But a whole career in science by Jerome Kagan, an early contributor to Cerebrum, an unfailing supporter of my work, changed all that. He's a famous psychologist at Harvard. He made temperament, that seemingly flighty, often affected emotional weather, the most solidly, deeply, extensively demonstrated aspect of our inherited nature. His work on temperament, if nothing else, pushes aside nurture far enough to make a lot of room in the individual personality for nature. His most recent book, excellent. Many books on it, he spent a lifetime, but that. I can't review here the decades of research by Kagan and his colleagues, and it included tracking a large cohort of individuals, more than 450, from 4 months of age through, so far, young adulthood. That's no mean feat. It's rare, given the centrifugal forces that scatter us, from infancy to adulthood, to follow up that many. Let me give you a flavor of the research. This is at 4 months, the children. The mothers brought their rested and recently fed infants to my Harvard laboratory, where a woman presented them with a series of unfamiliar sights, sounds, and smells. The infants saw mobiles of brightly colored objects and stuffed animals that moved slowly back and forth in front of their faces, heard voices speaking sentences coming from a speaker without the presence of a person, and experienced the subtle odor of diluted alcohol on a cotton swab placed beneath their noses. So what was being measured here that Kagan calls temperament? In Kagan's words at one point, what was being measured was their threshold of arousal in reaction to unfamiliar and unexpected events. Always what he was measuring under these as controlled as possible conditions was how different infants respond to the same stimulus, which was sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes neutral, sometimes unexpected, novel, sometimes not, based entirely on behavior, which you have to, when your subjects are 4 months old, you do have to base everything on observing behavior because they don't like to fill out surveys. He began to define some categories. As he comments, we're in a position of Darwin when he observed systematic variations among tortoises and finches, but had no idea what the underlying mechanism was that mediated those variations until he came up with evolution. Today, we know that Darwin observed that the difference he observed resulted from genes interacting with environment. For temperaments, we do have a few more clues to mechanism, as I'll talk, and even some measurements in the brain that correlate with them. But how did he categorize his observations? Kagan is a rigorous scientist insisting on controlled experiments and observations. maintained over years, and he limits his description to behavior. Here's an example of the 4 initial categories of temperamental differences. Ultimately, he identified 23. Infants who cry intensely at some discomfort and do not soothe easily. Infants who cry intensely but soothe easily. Infants who cry softly, less intensely, and soothe easily. Another such quartet can be identified by infant reactions not to discomfort, but something new and novel. Some of the infants, pulled away or cried or tried to turn over, and others babbled and reached for them. And this wasn't just once. I mean, they're observing these infants over and over. This is characteristic. In all, as I say, he isolates 23 consistently identifiable patterns. Now, temperament on this level is not emotions. Remember, emotions are automatic, psychosomatic value judgments to what's good for us and bad for us. You can't have an emotion unless you have an experience. There are no prenatal emotions. These are temperamental biases. These are measurements of how your emotional mechanism seems to be working. Is it really keyed up like Woody Allen, or is it really laid back like Cool Hand Luke, and everything in between? I mean, I'm exaggerating, but first, stop on the term bias. Kagan explains that the various temperaments are biases. What does he mean? He's referring to the concept of biological preparedness, which can be illustrated in simpler terms in monkeys. Oh, those are the temperaments of 4. Okay. A monkey born in the laboratory with no experience of snakes is not afraid of them. But if he observes another monkey reacting to snakes with fear, he immediately develops the fear and never loses it. No matter how many times he sees another monkey reacting with fear to a flower, and they do this experiments because monkeys can respond to screens and such. No matter how often he sees another monkey responding with fear to a flower, he does not develop fear of flowers, instantly of snakes. And I would suggest to you that our primate evolution has put something of that in us too. I think there's an innate tendency to immediately adopt fear of snakes. It's just too widespread not to. So the monkey is biologically prepared to develop a specific emotion. So temperamental biases appear to preclude a certain type of personality, certain types, much more readily than they shape an actual personality. They set parameters. It's useful now to see how Kagan proceeds to cluster these temperamental biases into observable behavior types. He offers us 4 kinds of temperament that seem to persist from 4 months to a year to 2 years, 4 years, 11 years, 15 years into adulthood. In characterizing these temperamental clusters, you'll see he sticks to descriptions of behavior. About 20% of infants, 1 in 5, reacts to unexpected events, the new and surprising, by thrashing its arms and legs and crying. And, it appears metaphorically they keep thrashing throughout life. You know who I mean. These Kagan labels high reactive. Think of Woody Allen characters. 40%, twice as many infants, 2 to 5, display the opposite profile. They remain still, rarely cry or arch their backs, often babble and smile. These Kagan labels low reactive. Again, think of Paul Newman characters. I'm not saying the actors, I'm saying the characters they portray. Other infants didn't fit into any of these endpoints very well. They were in various places between, which is not surprising. These are the ends, high reactive, low reactive. So do high and low reactive infants portend distinct behavioral, emotional, and biological profiles in later childhood and life? They definitely do. As children, the high reactive infants tended to have many fears, persistent fears. The low reactive tend to have few, if any, fears. Twice as many low reactive kids at 4.5 were sociable and talkative. The high reactive were shy, quiet, and stood right beside their mothers. As many as possible of these children were followed up and tested in appropriate ways at regular intervals for decades to come. There was a surprising stability in those initial categories of emotional reactivity observed at 4 months. Here are two of the infants, both 16-year-olds now. An attractive 16-year-old high school junior, Marjorie, wearing a white blouse buttoned to her neck, sits stiffly on a hard chair for a 3-hour interview in the living room of her middle-class Boston suburb. Her replies to the initial questions about homework and hobbies are typical of teenage girls from her social class, although they are terse, spoken in a soft voice, and accompanied by restless fidgeting with her hair, face, clothes, few spontaneous smiles, and frequent bursts of eye blinks. Humans begin to blink rapidly when they are feeling uncertain or anxious. Marjorie tells Valerie, the interviewer, that she has a good relationship with her affectionate parents, several close friends, usually get A's along with a few B's in her courses, and prefers the solitary hobby of tennis to team sports like soccer. And a bit later in this long description, she cannot sleep before important exams and sometimes vomits on evenings when she is excessively anxious about her performance the next day. She dislikes meeting strangers, feels uneasy when touched, and is worried about an imminent class trip to Washington, D.C., because she's not sure how she'll feel in an unfamiliar city talking with adolescents she does not know well. And now another interview. A few days later, the interviewer, Valerie interviewed Lisa, an equally attractive 16-year-old high school junior from a nearby middle-class suburb. Lisa, dressed in loose-fitting sweater and a short skirt, sat on the sofa with her legs tucked up. She reported that she loves variety, enjoys visiting new places, is president of her class, member of the school chorale, and the soccer team. She sleeps deeply, rarely has nightmares, gets excellent grades without brooding about examination. Her answers often slid into a garrulous offering of anecdotes accompanied by frequent smiles, bursts of laughter, a relaxed posture, and facial smiles free of eye blinks. Now, in the interest of brevity, I have to summarize here. Over time, there were certain changes in temperament along the spectrum because of nurture and choice. There definitely was movement. And yet, among over 140 pursued from 4 months to adulthood, no one moved from high reactive to low reactive, or from low reactive to high reactive. The most they would do would be move toward the middle. Some power of change, but Woody Allen did not become Cool Hand Luke. You won't get a satisfying formal definition of temperament from Kagan, but Richard Davidson, who writes the foreword to the Temperamental Thread, puts it this way. Temperament refers to particular types of variation in human emotional response that are observable from very early life and assumed to be, at least in part, heritable. And we can add that those variations seem moderately stable in later years and identifiable patterns of behavior and psychological reactions. And increasingly, they've been correlated with differences in the brain. My own best shot at a definition is that temperament is the aspect of an individual's emotional makeup attributable to irreducibly basic emotional reactions observable in early infancy and assumed to be present at birth. Temperament is the contribution to a person's emotional patterns made by nature. Now, to talk a little bit about the brain, our emotional patterns certainly do appear to be mediated by molecules in the brain. More than 150 separate molecules have been identified. You've heard of some of these biological molecules: dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, oxytocin, vasopressin, opioids. They mediate emotions. The psychoactive drugs now prescribed to treat depression, say, or bipolar disorder, or panic attacks, work by manipulating these molecules. That doesn't prove anything about causes, by the way, just because, anyway, that's another subject. All these molecules plug into and activate or excite receptors on the surface of brain cells. Another whole set of molecules modulate the duration of the excitement. When certain molecules plug into brain cell receptors, they initiate a cascade of reactions that activate or inhibit the activation of our emotions, working through specific areas of the brain. The concentration of each molecule in the brain and the numbers and location of receptors for them seem to be controlled by our genes. Kagan estimates that perhaps 200 of our 30,000 structural genes, and that's less than 2% of the human genome, control the amount, type, and activity of these brain molecules and receptors. So these genes and their variations, or alleles as they're called, are different in every single human individual. Even identical twins don't have identical temperaments. For that matter, they don't have the same fingerprints, although they have exactly the same genes. So doing the math, Kagan suggests there are some potentially 2,000 biologically distinct temperaments. Not all, of course, are readily observable. You have to think, what are the categories in which we put our behavior? You know, what categories does our culture use? What do we view as relevant about personality? That's what we're going to notice in temperament. There might be a very different culture with very different standards that would really put a lot more attention on other temperaments. But for us, the ones he points out seem to stand out. We know that temperament is modified by nature. In fact, every time we experience anything or learn anything, our brain changes, and that requires the genes to make new protein. Every time you make a long-term memory, your genes are actually making new protein up there. Every time we create a long-term memory, the genes change the protein to store it. And behavior can modify how our genes are expressed. If a mother rat licks her pups a lot, she permanently downregulates their level of anxiety, which is a change in gene expression. Personally, I never got enough licking. That might be part of the problem. But what about ways other than genetic that nature may alter brain chemistry and temperament? What about ways other than genes? These are mostly prenatal. Some of the well-known ones: the month the child is conceived. Because hours of daylight influence the mother's physiology, particularly the powerful brain chemical melatonin. This varies greatly with geographical latitude, and that may have to do with the northern, that's Polish, Dutch, Russian, versus the southern, Italian, Spanish temperament. Good, he's got a whole chapter on that. I'm not going to discuss it. Unusual conditions during pregnancy. For example, the number of boys a mother has delivered previously. The number of boys she's had previously has a high and persistent correlation in the later born sons with low birth weight, less adult height, and particularly a gay lifestyle in the adult male. If you're the third son or the fourth, by then your body has begun to develop defenses, immunities against the male hormone, which her body does not accept. So the fetus is fighting against a kind of suppression. And so there's lower birth weight, less adult height, and apparently some part of the brain that accounts for human sexual response it seems possibly modified by that fact too. Binge drinking by mothers during pregnancy. About 15% of mothers, this was 10 years ago, actually admitted to binge drinking during pregnancy. That results in many effects on infants. One of the most interesting is the child tends to be born with slightly asymmetrical features. And you know, asymmetrical features are consistently perceived as less physically attractive in children and adults. Mothers exposed to flu during pregnancy. In rats, this produces more fearful pups who are unwilling to explore unfamiliar places. In humans, there's a small but definite correlation with schizophrenia in early adulthood. Then 3 to 5% of single births are to parents who don't realize that a twin died during the pregnancy. It died very early, so there's no sign of it, and that may have affected the remaining embryo. So all of these are biological influences on the brain, on brain chemistry and aspects of nature, but they're more developmental than they are genetic, prenatal. Essential to the concept of temperament, I said, is the differing quality, intensity, and duration of reactions to the new and unexpected. These reactions range from anxiety, fear, and rejection on one hand, to calm, interest, acceptance, pleasure on the other. Among the brain structures that mediate such reactions are the amygdala. That's what initiates our startle response, our fear, our fight or flight response. And also, mediating such reactions is the prefrontal cortex, where judgments can modify the emotions. Humans vary systematically in the excitability of the amygdala and how quickly and to what degree those reactions are modulated by the prefrontal cortex. In response to the unexpected, the amygdala activates a full fifth of a second before the brain actually detects the meaning of an event. So when I'm walking along the path and there's something like that going across, I go, oh! A fifth of a second later, I see it's a stick. But I'd be dead if I waited a fifth of a second and it was a snake. So my amygdala has, over time, has taught me to jump back and then have a look. But the speed with which that happens in people varies, and the intensity of what the amygdala signals to them. About 1 in 7 house cats is a scaredy cat. Notably timid, not given to exploring the unfamiliar, not approaching strangers, and leaving rats strictly alone. This timidity is first observed in kittens at 2 months of age. And at that time, scientists, they can put them in brain scanners, unlike 2-month-old children. At this time, scientists see their amygdala becomes unusually excited, much more so than ordinary cats, especially in reaction to sound. We can't put human infants in a magnetic resonance scanner. Too expensive, parents freak out. University review committee says, forget it. When Kagan's human subjects were 11 and 15 years of age, 4 of their biological reactions could be measured non-invasively, and they're indirect signs of excitability of the amygdala: brain waves, heart rate, blood pressure. Again, those tended to vary with the excitability of the amygdala, and in blind controlled trials where the people who did this didn't know who was who, it was very much correlated with the temperament all through from the beginning. For example, there are big differences in the amygdala's reaction to loud sounds, which some people find highly distressing and some acceptable or pleasurable. You know who you are. Right. This is more me. What are we talking about here? I now depart from Professor Kagan. These are my own speculations. I think we're talking about a genetically determined degree of sensitivity in part of our brain's emotional system. Our individual emotional apparatus may be more or less reactive to what comes our way in the world, but particularly, it seems, anything that upsets, intrudes upon our comfort zone. For some of us, the new, unknown, unpredictable in the world, where we're not as in control as we are in our own space, is more uncomfortable, unnerving, anxiety-ridden than for others. We're talking about susceptibility to what's actually psychic pain. As Rad made clear this morning, negative emotions, hurt. And the pain pulls us to warn away, to pull away, warns us to pull back. Our initial reaction is to restrict our sphere of involvement to what we know, where we're in control. To the extent we're passive in the face of our temperamental sensitivities, they become us. But for objectivists to affirm the imperative of freely initiated thought, panic, freely initiated thought, high reactivity. This is the same situation as presented by nurture. What are we going to do about it? To what extent, in spite of possible pressures, anxious uncertainty, uneasy fears, social discomfort, we're going to assert our values? Dealing with, people less like us is unnerving. Stay with our own kind. Flying on planes scares us. Don't do it. Making telephone calls causes us anxiety. Let your low reactive spouse make them. Avoid psychic pain. Back off. But isn't the objectivist response the heroic stance to identify our values and act to achieve them, whatever the discomfort? whatever the headwinds of anxiety, to refuse to be trapped by our biology, in Shakespeare's grand rhetoric, to take arms against a sea of troubles. But as objectivists, the goal of our actions is happiness. Our means to happiness is the values we choose by reason, and the values appropriate to human nature, but they're also appropriate to our own individual nature to some extent. Not that those appropriate to our individual nature would be different generically from those man's nature, but there's room in there. Is this the case with temperament? Acknowledging what cannot be changed and what can, we choose our values and actions. I say this because Kagan warns us that temperament sets limits on our experience of happiness. My speculation is that if we constantly act in spite of our temperament, scraping against our inherent sensitivities, we can change our behavior, but we might be ultimately less happy. Kagan describes high reactive subjects who found careers and life situations, for example, they relied more on themselves and less on dealing with others, that led to considerable contentment. But is mere contentment heroic? Certainly there should be constant challenges to one's talents, constant growth. But is it enough in this world to be limited and acknowledge that we're limited by our temperament? Well, I don't admire people who decline to push against the limits of their temperament, who decline to experience some emotional discomfort as the price of enlarging their world. I think they're coddling themselves and letting the world close in on them. Kagan offers the example of tough love, that very difficult group of kids who were in the disturbing category, cry easily and difficult to soothe. If their mother was tough with them at a very early age, they tended to permanently reduce their timidity up to a point. Toughness, tough love. So the point is to pursue our values, and the point of that is happiness. When we reach a place when further pursuit of our values in a given direction reduces our overall happiness, then we have to have the grace to accept what we cannot change. I hope it's not a grace we grant easily. Better that it be submission to hard-won knowledge of our emotional limits. Well, I wish I could pay attention to, because I can't, temperament and gender, but we started late. Temperament and ethnicity, temperament and mental illness, each gets a chapter in Kagan. I wish I could look at how evolution in historical time, say 8,000 years, that's 400 generations, plenty of time for the genes to work, how that may have begun to shape the genes that control our brain chemistry, and so temperament toward the low reactive side. Remember, there are already twice as many among American whites as twice as many low reactives as high reactives. So producing individuals more inclined to embrace rapid change, to live with uncertainty. As civilization technology speeded up, who was going to survive? You adapt to the new, you react to the new, you don't pull away, you don't hide away. Well, I wish I could, I'm going to have to skip a little here. I was going to talk about, I think that what we'll all do is first try on these clothes of temperament myself. I'm a high reactive with blue eyes. Temperament seems to be correlated with eye color, and far more individuals with blue eyes are high reactive and far more with brown eyes are low reactive. High reactive individuals are more susceptible to certain disorders like allergies. I'm a high reactive with blue eyes who married two brown-eyed women. Not sure about second, but the current is low reactive. Her favorite comment is, calm down. I don't want to calm down. That makes me more nervous. Okay, well, I got to skip along here. Let me see if there's any one more thing I wanted to say. Bad planning, Walter. That was me as a high reactive infant, young man fishing. Let's end with the good Professor Kagan. He seems to categorize himself as high reactive and avoids being ashamed of it. He writes, I confess to some sadness when I reflect on the fact that some adults, because of the temperament they inherited, find it difficult to experience on most days the relaxed feeling of happiness that a majority of our society believe is life's primary purpose. If life were just a high reactive temperamental bias imposed on an innocent infant and a loving family should not make it so difficult for this person, who as an adult is prudent, persistent, loyal, and talented, to savor more well-earned moments of unrestrained joy. Well, God doesn't remember predetermining that. It's just the way the world is. Well, let's see. I like this as a description of the courage to change. It's from In Memory of William Butler. With your unconstraining voice, still persuade us to rejoice. In the prison, not quite prison, of his days, teach the free man how to praise. In other words, it's our recognition and joy in our human freedom that may transfigure many pressures of nurture, and the same human freedom can accept with grace what's in our nature, and that approach toward life merits the reward and moral crown that is happiness. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. And we do have time for questions, so if you could come up to the mic since we're recording this and ask your question, we would appreciate it. Yeah, there's one over there too, so either one.
Hi, thanks for that talk. I'm a bit confused as to how the research on 4-month-old children controls for the environmental factors.
Well, it can't entirely. Everybody's environment, nobody has the exact same environment, except if, you know, you genetically bred rat in a certain laboratory. Kagan said we deliberately only used white children of middle-class parents living in comfortable suburbs, average suburbs, and we would like to have tried other races, but we realized that introduced a distorting factor. So we tried to keep that same. We told our mothers to bring their infants in when they weren't sick, when they were well-fed, and when there wasn't any, you know, special outside stress in their life. They did the best they could, but 140 infants from, you know, different families around Boston, there's a limit. But that's how they tried.
Okay, I should have been more specific.
Yeah.
So is it the case that because the child wasn't brought in upon the day of birth to receive the temperament testing?
No, not at birth. 4
Right,
months,
and
yeah.
so is it the case then that that period between birth and when the testing begins is thought not to have an environmental influence? Because it seems like that would be a confounding factor you would need to control for in order to demonstrate that it's a biological origin of temperament as opposed to an environmental factor.
Yeah, I believe they felt that by 4 months of age, the very distinct differences, the distinct, persistent differences that they saw probably could not have been formed in the first 4 months. But I'm answering that without quite knowing how Kagan would answer. They started at 4 months. I don't know. That's very early to begin testing. So, yeah, you could argue that the temperaments were formed in the first 4 months. I want to know, what do you say about that?
I have a couple of questions, but I'll ask one of them now. Great presentation. You know, the temperament forms, as you say, an important part of who we are, but a small part of who we are. Maybe that's too narrow. There's so many other factors as well that form who we are as adults. And how do we, when we have we have all these factors that have come together, and our values, or the way we've taken our lives, various other things, how do we then tease apart our temperament as adults? We are not 4 months old anymore. You know, one could, you know, maybe I'm shy, but because of all my experiences, I've gone pretty far, and it looks like I look to myself like I'm, you know, very extroverted.
I focused on the evidence for how temperament is shaped by nature. In his long book, The Temperamental Thread, in fact, Kagan discusses what he sees as all the influences on temperament and how they come together and influence one another, and at what point does it become difficult to distinguish. So it certainly does. I mean, there are other, what about sense of life? Sense of life isn't temperament. I have a strong feeling personally, you know, you observe people that you know, and you begin to, that temperament really influences sense of life. Remember, sense of life is our emotional mechanism recording how we react and feel about every single thing that has happened to us in our entire life, integrating it emotionally into a metaphysics. And every one of those emotions, if Kagan is right, is biased in one direction or another by temperament, and it's bound to add up differently. If, just like if every single experience you have a certain element of high reactivity, more discomfort, it's going to add up to a different metaphysic. But I haven't really answered because you're right, there are many factors, and he takes that into account. And although it doesn't seem, as far as he's followed these people, it doesn't seem that the length of time that they've been out in the world especially affects the rate of what he measured. It doesn't seem to. He's up to the mid-20s now, and it seems to be holding fast. So that might suggest that, that it does remain an identifiable factor. Not a very good answer, but psychology is complicated.
How does this discovery, if you will, affect the tabula rasa argument of Ayn Rand's?
Well, our minds are born without any innate knowledge, because knowledge comes from experience, and we don't. You can argue a bit about prenatal experience, but that's okay, because that's not. I mean, that's before birth, but it's not inborn from God or anything like that. It's still experience. So without experience, we don't have any knowledge with tabula rasa. And as I said, if the claim were that emotions were inherent, that would run right into objectivism, because objectivism says emotions are sometimes subconscious, but always psychosomatic response to our evaluation, good for me or bad for me. So if I see a lion coming for me, I've got one emotional judgment, and if it's a rabbit, unless I'm really low high reactive, I'm not as afraid.
Well,
so emotions would violate tabula rasa, but this is not. This is the mechanism. This is the mechanism of emotion.
I'm thinking more in the case of temperamental bias. You're biased toward the cognitive content that you're going to receive. You have a selective, that would create a selection, a selectiveness.
Well, sure. I mean, the whole brain is filled with biases about how we do things. For example, the whole sensory perceptual system is filled with biases about what categories we'll make, how we'll line things up, what we'll see, what we'll notice, the way our memory works. I mean, the memory for faces is unbelievably powerful, because that was once an important evolutionary friend or foe, much more so than for names. There's all kinds of biases built into the brain, but that's not knowledge.
No.
That's not knowledge. That's more getting down to the fine strokes of what we have a capacity to do, more capacity or less, and that's not tabula rasa.
Okay.
I'm actually going to ask two questions. One of which is, does the principle that man is a being of self-made soul in fact underscore the significance of characteristics that we have at birth on a principle of compound interest, because the person who is shaping your soul is the person you are at this point, shaping the person you're going to be,
I don't think the
and
temperament
so on.
compromises that at all. After all, if I said, well...
It underscores.
Yeah, because if I said, we're not beings of self-made soul, because look, we have to conform to reality. This is this, I can't. All kinds of things I can't do and change. If I said that, you'd say, no. Self-made soul is you and your nature within the context of reality.
Walter, I'm not sure you heard my question.
What?
I'm not sure you heard my question.
I think so.
Because what I'm asking is, doesn't, by a principle of compound interest, the principle that man is a being of self-made soul make it even more important where you start out, because it's who you are at any given time that's shaping who you become next.
Always, right? I see what you mean. You mean the early factors are likely to be much, much more powerful because they'll have longer to work on you than later factors. So a very early temperamental bias is going to have an ability to collect interest and compound as you go along, and therefore you're going to have your challenges about self-made soul. Is that?
I'm actually saying that as you make your own soul,
Yeah.
it's the you that already exists
Yeah.
that's doing that.
Yeah. I agree.
And the other,
How does that relate to temperament? How does that relate?
well, if temperament is part of who you are when you start this
Yes.
process of making your own
Right.
soul, then it's there throughout, and each time you do something that shapes yourself going forward, it's there and it's part of the you that's doing that. And that therefore is not contrary to the principle of self-made soul, but helps us understand how it works.
Right. Right. Self-made soul has nothing to do with where you start. It's what you do with where you are, no matter how it develops.
The other question I wanted to raise is, can you talk a little bit more about strategies for dealing with what we observe in ourselves in this vein? So, for example, if we find that we are, if one finds that one is excessively distressed by the new, might one say, well, okay, in order to be able to have an ambitious career, I really want to be able to face a lot of the new there, so let me try to stabilize as much as possible of other aspects.
I think I said that. I tried to say that, I think certainly that you push against, to attain your values, your ambitions, you consider temperament something that you have to work with, and if it takes a bit of a struggle, why, that's reality, for sure. But on the other hand, if you find it over a long period of time that you're achieving things, but actually you're not as happy because you've put yourself in a situation where you're constantly scraping against your temperament, then maybe you should choose something else. For example, if you say, I've always wanted to be a car salesman like my dad, but I'm high reactive, and I tried and tried and tried, and I'm nervous every morning, my stomach twists, I'm doing well. Hey, maybe do something that doesn't put you as much in contact with people in the new and gives you more control of your space. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't think you should give in to that easily, but once you see it's the reality of your nature, sure. All right?
Okay, that's
All right.
right on time, and very good talk. We'll be around, so ask him further questions.